In the early hours of May 14th, 1918, in the middle of a dark forest in France, a single American soldier came face to face with an entire group of enemies. Without support, wounded and surrounded, he made a decision that would change the course of the war forever. His name was Henry Johnson. And what happened that night seems impossible, but it is real. Long before any battlefield, long before France, the trenches, and the war, Henry Johnson was just another invisible man within a deeply divided America. He was born around 1892 in Winston-Salem, in the southern United States, a region marked by intense racial tensions, even decades after the end of slavery. While still young, he moved to Albany, where he would spend most of his life before the war. But that geographic change did not mean real freedom. The country still operated under the rigid structures of the Jim Crow laws, a system that institutionalized racial segregation and drastically limited opportunities for men like him. In Albany, Johnson lived an ordinary but extremely harsh life. He worked various jobs before the war, including as a driver, a laborer, and mainly as a baggage porter at train stations. It was a physical, repetitive, and exhausting job that demanded long hours and offered little stability. This type of work was common among black men at the time, not because of a lack of ability, but because of a lack of opportunity. Johnson was not seen as someone with potential, much less as someone who could one day become a hero. He was just another anonymous worker, living on the margins of a society that tolerated him, but did not value him. When World War I began in 1914, the United States initially remained out of the conflict. But within the country, something important was already happening. Many African American men saw the war as an opportunity. They believed that by fighting for the country, they could prove their worth and perhaps change the way they were treated. It was a risky bet, based more on hope than on evidence. Even so, thousands decided to enlist. In June of 1917, shortly after the official entry of the United States into the war, Henry Johnson made that decision. At approximately 25 years old, he enlisted in the American Army. There were no guarantees of recognition, no real promises of equality. But there was a chance to step out of invisibility, a chance to be part of something greater than the limited life that had been imposed on him since birth. He was assigned to the 15th New York National Guard Regiment, a unit composed entirely of black soldiers that would later be redesignated as the legendary 369th Infantry Regiment. At that moment, however, no one called them heroes. In fact, within the American Army itself, there was resistance to allowing these soldiers to fight. Many white officers did not want African Americans in direct combat, preferring to assign them to support roles. But Henry Johnson's destiny would not be decided by expectations or limitations imposed by others. Without knowing it, he was about to be sent to one of the most brutal scenarios in modern history. And everything that once seemed small, invisible, and insignificant in his life was about to change completely. Because war does not choose who is ready, and soon it would choose Henry Johnson. On June 5th, 1917, just a few weeks after the United States officially entered World War I, Henry Johnson enlisted in the American Army. He was approximately 25 years old. There was no promise of glory. There was no guarantee of equality. But there was a growing feeling among many African Americans that this war could be an opportunity to prove their worth in a society that insisted on denying it. It was a decision filled with hope and also with a certain degree of naivety. Johnson was assigned to the 15th New York National Guard Regiment, a unit made up entirely of black soldiers. This regiment, which would later be redesignated as the legendary 369th Infantry Regiment, began its training at Camp Wadsworth in the state of South Carolina. And it was there that reality began to impose itself in a brutal way. Even wearing the uniform of the United States Army, those men were still treated as second-class citizens. White officers often doubted the abilities of black soldiers, and segregation was maintained within the military ranks themselves. The commander of the American forces in Europe, John J. Pershing, made a decision that would define the regiment's fate. In order to preserve the segregationist structure of the American Army, he chose to transfer black units to serve under French command. In practice, this meant separating these soldiers from white American troops. But, ironically, this decision would end up placing men like Henry Johnson directly on the front lines of the war. In November of 1917, Johnson's regiment set sail for Europe. They arrived in France in December of 1917, where they were integrated into French forces that were already exhausted after years of continuous combat. Unlike the United States, the French army did not operate under the same level of institutionalized racial segregation. The soldiers of the 369th were quickly equipped with French weapons, including the Lebel rifle and Adrian helmets, and began to be treated as real combatants rather than just logistical support. That detail changed everything. While many African American regiments in the U.S. Army were assigned to tasks such as building roads, transporting supplies, or digging trenches, the 369th was sent directly into active combat. They were positioned on the Western Front, one of the most dangerous regions of the entire war, where the line between life and death was measured in seconds. And it was there that they began to build a reputation that would echo for decades. The soldiers of the 369th fought for 191 consecutive days on the front line, longer than any other American regiment during the entire war. This number is not just a historical fact. It represents months of constant exposure to bombardments, surprise attacks, extreme conditions, and death all around them. Over time, even the enemy began to recognize them. The Germans started calling them the Harlem Hellfighters, a direct reference to the ferocity with which they fought and the unusual resilience they showed under pressure. According to reports from the time, some captured German soldiers admitted they were more cautious when facing black American troops because of this reputation. But at that moment, Henry Johnson was still just one soldier among many. He did not yet know that in a matter of months, he would be placed in a situation where all of these experiences, the training, the discrimination, the resilience, and the adaptation to combat, would be pushed to the absolute limit. And that, on that night, he would be completely alone. When Henry Johnson's regiment arrived in France at the end of 1917, it stopped being just another segregated unit of the American Army and began to transform into something entirely different. Under French command, the former 15th New York National Guard Regiment was officially integrated as the 369th Infantry Regiment, and for the first time, those men were treated as real soldiers. But that change came with a price. They were not given privileges. They were not given rest. They were given combat. Equipped with French weaponry, including the Lebel rifle and Adrian helmets, the soldiers of the 369th were sent directly to the Western Front, one of the most brutal theaters of World War I. There, war was not defined by large strategic movements, but by continuous resistance. Flooded trenches, constant mud, intense cold, air contaminated by gas, and the permanent sound of explosions. It was an environment where time lost its meaning and survival became the only objective. The 369th quickly stood out. While other American units spent limited periods on the front lines, the men of the 369th remained for 191 consecutive days in active combat, the longest recorded time among all American regiments during the war. This number is not just impressive, it is almost incomprehensible. Months of constant exposure to attacks, bombardments, and dangerous missions without the usual rotation that other troops received. And the longer they stayed on the front lines, the more their reputation grew. German soldiers began to notice something different about that regiment, not only because of their endurance, but because of the way they fought. Their aggressiveness, their ability to hold positions under extreme pressure, and their refusal to retreat even in critical situations earned them a nickname that would echo through history: Harlem Hellfighters. Reports from the time indicate that captured German soldiers mentioned a particular caution when facing Black American troops, recognizing the difficulty in breaking their lines. It was something rare in a war where the enemy was almost never praised. But that reputation did not come without cost. The 369th also became one of the regiments with the highest number of casualties in the war. Hundreds of men were killed or wounded. Every advance was expensive. Every position held required real sacrifice. And still, they continued. Within this scenario, Henry Johnson was not an officer, not a high-ranking leader. He was a private, a regular soldier, placed in the same brutal environment as everyone else. But there was something that began to stand out: his physical endurance, his adaptation to combat, and above all, his mindset. He observed, he learned, he prepared. And in the middle of this constant routine of tension, night patrols became an essential part of the war. Small groups were sent to forward positions, often isolated, with the mission of watching enemy movements and preventing infiltration. These were silent missions, dangerous ones, and often ignored in the grand narratives of war. But it was exactly in one of these missions that everything would change. Because in May of 1918, Henry Johnson would be sent to one of those forward posts, a place where there was no margin for error, a place where reinforcements might not arrive in time. And when darkness fell that night, the reputation of the Harlem Hellfighters would be tested in a way no one could have predicted. May of 1918. The war had already transformed Europe into a landscape of continuous destruction, and in the region of the Argonne Forest, where French and German lines clashed daily, the tension was constant, almost suffocating. It was in this environment that Henry Johnson received a mission that, at first glance, seemed like just another routine task of war, but in reality was one of the most dangerous roles possible. On the night of May 14th to 15th, 1918, he was assigned to guard a forward outpost during the early hours of the morning, an isolated position ahead of the main line, where any mistake could mean immediate death. By his side was Needham Roberts, and together they were to remain at that point between midnight and 4 in the morning, watching, listening, and trying to anticipate any enemy movement. It was a silent mission where the greatest challenge was not only seeing in the dark, but interpreting what could not be seen. From the very first hours of the night, something felt wrong. Johnson had already noticed signs of unusual activity, especially the presence of German snipers in the area, which suggested that something larger might be unfolding. He did not ignore those signs. Even before fully settling into his position, he tried to warn Sergeant Roy Thompson, suggesting that more prepared or more alert men should be sent to that specific point. But his concern was not taken seriously. The response he received carried a tone of dismissal, almost as if he were exaggerating or being overly cautious. Still, Johnson did not allow that to stop him from acting. Without support and without reinforcement, he decided to prepare on his own. He took a box with around 30 grenades and began to carefully arrange them around him, placing each one strategically so he could access them quickly in case of an attack. It was not a standard procedure. It was pure instinct, the reaction of someone who understood that that night carried something different. Time moved slowly, and the darkness of the forest seemed to grow heavier, almost oppressive. Around 1 in the morning, the first concrete sign of danger appeared. A shot echoed through the silence, coming from somewhere unseen in the woods. A German sniper had attempted to hit their position. The shot missed, but the message was clear. They were being watched. Johnson once again tried to communicate the situation, reinforcing the imminent risk, but again, he received no effective response. No reinforcements were sent. No changes were made. There was nothing left but to wait. And that waiting was the worst part, because every second increased the feeling that something was about to happen. Shortly before 2 in the morning, what had been suspicion turned into certainty. Johnson heard a specific sound, almost imperceptible to anyone who was not fully alert, but impossible to ignore for an experienced soldier. It was the sound of wire being cut. A simple sound, but in that context, it meant only one thing. An attack was beginning. In that instant, there was no more doubt, no more time to think about reinforcements or higher orders. All that existed was the immediate reality in front of him. Without hesitation, without waiting, Henry Johnson positioned himself, grabbed the grenades he had carefully prepared, and got ready for what was coming out of the darkness. He knew he was isolated. He knew there was no guarantee of help. And even so, he chose to stay. He chose to fight. The sound of wire being cut was only the beginning. In that instant, the darkness stopped being silence and started to conceal movement, intention, and death. Henry Johnson had no time to confirm what he already knew, because within seconds, the attack began. Shadows started to emerge in front of the position, and before any order could be given, German grenades were thrown directly toward the outpost. The explosion briefly lit up the scene, revealing what Johnson had suspected since the beginning of the night. This was not a small patrol. It was a much larger force, organized to breach the line and capture Allied soldiers. Beside him, Needham Roberts was hit almost immediately. Shrapnel and impact left him severely wounded in the arm and hip, taking away his ability to fight at that moment. In a matter of seconds, Johnson went from being part of a pair to standing alone against a coordinated assault. Without hesitation, he reacted. His first action followed exactly what he had prepared hours earlier. He grabbed one of the grenades he had arranged around him and threw it toward the advancing Germans. The explosion forced a brief retreat, but it was not enough to stop the attack. More shadows kept emerging from the darkness, moving quickly toward the position. Johnson began throwing grenade after grenade, using each one with precision, trying to keep distance and prevent the enemy soldiers from getting close enough to overwhelm him. At the same time, he tried to keep Roberts conscious, ordering him to stay low and help however he could. Even wounded, Roberts began handing grenades to Johnson inside the trench, creating an improvised dynamic of survival in the middle of chaos. The attack intensified. Gunfire started cutting through the air from all directions. Johnson began taking hits while fighting. He was wounded in the head, the lips, the hands, and across his body, yet he kept moving. There was no pause, no space to calmly assess the situation. Every second demanded an immediate response. Even under constant fire, he held his position. The grenades were running low, the number of enemies was not, and the distance between them was closing fast. The Germans were not just trying to eliminate the position, they wanted to capture soldiers, gather intelligence, break the line. And at that moment, everything standing between them and that objective was a single man who refused to retreat. When the grenades became scarce, Johnson changed strategy. He grabbed his rifle and began firing directly at the figures advancing through the darkness. For a few moments, it managed to hold them back. But the pressure was constant, and the fight was getting closer and closer. In the middle of the exchange of fire, a technical mistake happened. As he tried to reload, Johnson used incompatible ammunition with the French rifle he was carrying, causing the weapon to jam. In any other situation, this would have been the end. A soldier alone, wounded, surrounded, and now without a functioning weapon. But what happened next followed no conventional logic of combat. Without wasting time, Johnson turned the rifle into an improvised weapon. He gripped it by the stock and moved forward, using it like a club to strike any enemy who came close. The fight shifted from distance to hand combat. The Germans were now close enough to attempt a full takeover of the position. And even in that situation, he did not fall back. He moved forward. Every movement was now pushed to the physical limit, his body already compromised by wounds, sustained by something that went beyond training. And in that moment, the confrontation stopped being just a military attack. It became a fight for survival. And Henry Johnson was not finished yet. With the rifle jammed in his hands and the enemy already within reach, Henry Johnson crossed an invisible line that separates ordinary combat from something far more brutal. The distance between him and the German soldiers no longer allowed for any long-range strategy. There was no space left to retreat or reorganize. Everything was reduced to instinct, to immediate reaction, and to the decision to keep fighting even when every condition pointed to the opposite. Wounded, bleeding, and practically surrounded, he began using his own rifle as a blunt weapon, striking with force at every enemy who tried to get close. There was no tactical precision in that moment, only fast, aggressive, continuous movements, trying to maintain any form of control over a situation that had already slipped far beyond anything standard. The Germans kept advancing, trying to take the position and capture soldiers. In the middle of the chaos, some of them managed to reach Needham Roberts, who was still wounded inside the trench. That was the moment when the situation reached a critical point. It was no longer just about resisting the attack. Now, Johnson had to prevent his companion from being taken. Without hesitation, he completely shifted his posture. Instead of defending, he moved into direct attack. He charged at the soldiers trying to capture Roberts, using the rifle as an extension of his own body, pushing, striking, and forcing space through sheer force. Even with multiple wounds, he did not slow down. Every movement was executed at maximum intensity, as if each second could be his last. At some point in the confrontation, the rifle was no longer enough. Johnson then reached for the last weapon he had available, a bolo knife, a short, heavy blade designed for close combat. From that moment on, the fight became even more visceral. He began attacking directly, cutting, advancing, and forcing the German soldiers to fall back. Later, he would say that every strike had a purpose, that nothing was done out of empty impulse. But in that environment, it is impossible to separate calculation from survival. What remained visible was a single man facing an entire group of enemies and somehow managing to keep them all at bay. The combat stretched over a period that felt endless, It is estimated that around 1 hour passed from the beginning of the attack until reinforcements finally arrived. During all that time, Johnson kept fighting. He continued to be hit. By the end of the confrontation, at least 21 wounds were counted, including cuts, punctures, and gunshot injuries. Even so, he never abandoned his position. He never left the post. He never allowed the enemy to complete their objective. When reinforcements finally arrived, the scene was difficult to comprehend. The forward post was still under control. The Germans had retreated. On the ground, there were clear signs of what had happened there. Enemy soldiers dead, others severely wounded, abandoned weapons, unexploded grenades. Later reports indicated that at least 4 German soldiers had been killed, and a much larger number had been wounded, possibly reaching into the dozens. But more important than the numbers was the direct outcome of it all. The line had been held, the infiltration had been stopped, and a wounded soldier had not been captured. When asked about what he had done that night, Johnson did not describe it as an extraordinary act. According to accounts, his response was simple. He said he had only fought for his own life. But for those who analyzed the scene, for those who understood the context of that war, what happened there was far from ordinary. Because what took place that night was not just resistance. It was something that very few men in any war could ever repeat. When the combat finally ended in that early morning of May 1918, Henry Johnson's name began to spread quickly among French officers. What had happened at that forward position was not seen as an ordinary combat episode, but as an act of courage beyond any standard. In a short time, the reports reached the French command, and the response was immediate. Johnson became one of the first American soldiers to receive France's highest military decoration, the Croix de Guerre, with a bronze palm, a distinction reserved for acts of extreme bravery in direct combat against the enemy. At that moment, still on European soil, he was recognized as a hero. His name came to represent something greater than a simple soldier. He became a symbol of resistance, courage, and the ability to face the impossible. But while he was celebrated in France, the reality in the United States was different. When the war ended in November 1918, Johnson returned home as part of a regiment that had earned international respect. In 1919, he took part in the Victory Parade on Fifth Avenue in New York, alongside the men of the 369th Infantry Regiment. The scene was grand. Crowds in the streets, applause, celebration. For a brief moment, it seemed that recognition had finally crossed the ocean. Newspapers reported his story, some called him a hero, others even referred to the confrontation as the Battle of Henry Johnson. He was given the nickname Black Death, a direct reference to the impact he had on German soldiers. But that moment did not last. As soon as the euphoria faded, reality imposed itself again. Despite the severe wounds he had suffered during the war, Johnson did not receive adequate support from the American government. There was no consistent compensation, no continuous medical care. The injuries he carried, including serious physical damage that affected his ability to work, began to limit his life completely. He tried to return to his routine in Albany, but faced constant difficulties. Jobs were scarce. The pain was constant. And the society he had helped defend continued to treat him the same way it had before the war. Unable to maintain stability, his life began to deteriorate. Reports indicate that he faced serious financial problems, along with physical and emotional consequences that were never properly treated. In the midst of this, his family was also affected. His wife eventually left, taking their children with her, leaving Johnson even more isolated. The man who had faced an entire group of enemy soldiers alone was now facing something different, a silent struggle without recognition, without support, and without any kind of protection. On July 1st, 1929, Henry Johnson died in Washington at just 32 years of age. The official cause was myocarditis, an inflammation of the heart. But there is a historical consensus that his condition was directly linked to the wounds and consequences of the war. He did not die in combat. He died years later, carrying the effects of that conflict within his own body without ever having received, during his lifetime, recognition proportional to what he had done. And perhaps that is one of the hardest points of this entire story. Because while other names were celebrated, while heroes were turned into national symbols, Henry Johnson slowly disappeared from collective memory, not because of a lack of deeds, but because of something much deeper. He had fought for a country that was not yet ready to recognize him. For decades, the name Henry Johnson remained almost forgotten in the United States. While his story survived in fragments, often confined to military circles or the memory of the African American community, the official recognition that should have come during his lifetime never arrived. But this story does not end in 1929. It continues, slowly, being rebuilt by those who refused to let his name disappear. Among them was his own son, Herman Johnson, who years later began a persistent campaign for the country to finally acknowledge what had happened on that night in May of 1918. He was not alone. Over time, historians, veterans, and political figures began to revisit documents, reports, and testimonies that revealed the true scale of what Henry Johnson had done. Among those who took up this cause, Senator Chuck Schumer stands out, bringing the case forward within the American government and pushing for an official review of the decorations. Investigations were reopened, old records were re-examined, and key documents came to light, including first-hand witness accounts and military communications from the time, such as memorandums from General John J. Pershing, which had already acknowledged the extraordinary level of courage demonstrated by Johnson in combat. Slowly, what had been ignored for decades began to be corrected. The first step came in 1996, when President Bill Clinton posthumously awarded Henry Johnson the Purple Heart, officially recognizing the wounds he had suffered during the war. Years later, in 2002, he received the Distinguished Service Cross, the second highest military honor in the United States, but it still was not the highest recognition. Something was still missing. The acknowledgement proportional to what had truly happened that night had yet to come. That moment finally arrived on June 2nd, 2015, at the White House, in front of officials, military representatives, and historians. President Barack Obama awarded Henry Johnson, nearly a century after his death, the highest military decoration of the United States, the Medal of Honor. In that moment, the country officially recognized what had already been evident since 1918, that a single soldier, alone, wounded, and surrounded, had stopped an enemy assault, saved another man's life, and held a position that could have been lost. But the recognition came too late. Henry Johnson was not there to receive his medal. He did not see his name restored. He did not see his story told the right way. All of this happened after he was gone, after years spent in anonymity, facing hardship, and carrying the consequences of a war the country chose to forget. Today, his name begins to occupy the place it should have held from the very beginning. He is remembered as one of the most courageous soldiers of World War I, a symbol of resistance, and a clear example of how history can fail, and how, even if late, it can still be corrected. And perhaps what makes this story so powerful is not only what Henry Johnson did that night, but how long it took for the world to admit that he did it.